This presentation has its roots in the processes and findings outlined in the research paper The Grey Space in the Middle, published by Intellect Books in 2019. This paper was co-written by myself, Martin Morris, along with fellow colleague Paddy Malloy, while teaching on the Illustration Animation BA Hons course at Kingston School of Art. It also delves into the further development of the ideas outlined by artist and lecturer Josh Armitage. In the published paper, we considered drawing through what David Bowie called the grey space in the middle, the idea that a piece of work is not finished until the audience come to it and add their own interpretation. He believed that a piece of art is about the grey space in the middle. This concept he aligned with the theories of artist Marcel Duchamp, who once stated that it is the interaction of the onlooker which makes the painting, and that whether we like something isn't the focus, as taste can't help you understand what art can be. As sometimes happens when teaching, you're left with the problem of having time left over at the end of the session that needs to be filled with something meaningful. At the end of one session of life drawing at Kingston, we had 40 minutes to spare, and so, out of a slight panic, I threw caution to the wind and instructed the students to make a memory drawing of the last thing they had just drawn. We were in the same boat. We didn't know what would happen, and neither did the students. Based on my own practice of drawing, the class was instructed not to picture in their minds the thing they drew from in front of them, but rather to remember how it felt to draw it, the charcoal making the line, the movement of the arm, the uncomfortable position they were sitting in. From that session, here is Angus Mitchell's memory drawing of Van Gogh's A Wheat Field with Cypresses. The top drawing was made over a period of 45 minutes as part of a long drawing exercise. The top drawing, the copy, has gesture and light, such as around the tree where the movement of the hand pushing the charcoal can clearly be seen. The bottom drawing is a memory drawing of the same Van Gogh painting drawn over a period of 25 minutes. The time taken to make the memory drawing differs from the copy drawing due to the information available to Angus in memory recall. Rather than picture the painting in his mind as a photograph, Angus was encouraged to remember how his body moved when making the observed copy drawing, to recall the differing physical postures he found himself in. We also asked Angus to remember how the use of the material had felt, how it had felt to smudge and push a line with his finger, and what the relation of that mark was to the edge of the picture plane. Of the experience, Angus said, "What was fascinating to me about memory drawing was how things were broken down to their essential elements. My mind had erased the unimportant information. I had focused on the essence of the image. Tonal areas are better defined, the image is clearer, and it looks much more to me how Van Gogh felt to me as I was observing it. The process was now much less about imitating than feeling and remembering. Employing gestural memory, remembering the movements of my hand and arm around the paper from my observational drawing to build the image, I was processing the work on a much deeper and more personal level. The drawing felt like it was coming from inside of me, onto the paper, rather from outside of me, or in front of me." Angus's memory drawing has differences from the observed copy drawing, not in being any better or worse, but in how the space feels, somehow pared down, the superfluous information in marks of the observed drawing discarded. Contemporary painter Anna Jung So spoke about the use of memory drawing as part of her practice in creating images. The following is from her show catalogue, Memories Through Line and Colour. Quote, "Through making paintings, I revisit my fragmented memories to understand the mysterious union of line and colour. We believe it can be argued this is demonstrated in Angus's memory drawing and his feedback. The spatial experience spoken of by Angus in the physicality of making the drawing and the feeling of the image coming from within him outward led us to consider VR as a tool to develop this insight further. Based on using VR briefly, it became obvious to us that it required movement of the body to engage with the technology. How might memory and the physicality in the act of drawing be seen and considered in VR? How might VR heighten the experience of drawing from memory? Here is a life drawing by student Miranda Temple Smith. It has been made over a few minutes in charcoal on A1 paper. In a separate room we set up VR and drawing software Quill, a VR drawing tool. We then approached Miranda and asked her to remake the drawing in the VR headset. Miranda had not drawn in VR until this point. Miranda is seen here in VR attempting to draw from memory the life drawing she had made in the life room only an hour or so before. While Miranda made her VR drawing, we simultaneously observed the drawing being made, the marks appearing detached from the artist's hand, flat on the computer monitor. Here are two viewpoints of the drawing Miranda made. We see different positions and objects in the room. As Miranda was drawing from memory of a previous experience, she found that in this space the objects drawn were a result of processing the physical act of drawing, or having a 360-degree viewpoint. As tutors, we found ourselves questioning not just the image Miranda was drawing, but how she was putting the image together, how she would kneel, stand on tiptoe, turn, and move her arms in outstretched arcs. When Miranda began to move in the 3D environment, the lines she had drawn began to parallax and no longer sat on a flat plane as drawings on paper do. Miranda realised that not just her arm and body, but also her senses were moving in space between herself and the imagined nude life model she was recreating. Her feedback gives greater insight into the experience, outcomes that can be taken forward by student and tutor alike. Quote, VR helps investigate memory connections in the brain. VR works symbiotically with memory. If one is drawing onto a flat surface, you are already subconsciously flattening it in your mind's eye, and so drawing in VR is plausibly more authentic as you remove the first reductive stage of image making. I was cocooning myself in VR, and it quickly became real, and my awareness of what I was drawing spread from where it usually constrained in my fingertips and wrist to my shoulder and the rest of my body, making it a fully immersive experience. In the VR drawing, we can see other elements in the room that were not in the original life drawing on paper. This is also noted by Miranda. Quote, free from the restrictions of working in 2 dimensions, I was surprised by how much information I could access with my memory. For example, what was behind me at the time. Being able to turn around and draw this was certainly an unusual feeling. It allowed me to access details I wouldn't have gotten through memory drawing on paper. Miranda's experience of the moments she was recalling were very real to her, despite some not being drawn from observation or even seen. This raises an important question. How much of this is memory? How much is imagination? Where is that line drawn? In his book, The Analysis of the Mind, published in 1921, Bertrand Russell posits, memory images and imagination images do not differ in their intrinsic qualities, so far as we can discover. They differ by the fact that the images that constitute memories, unlike those that constitute imagination, are accompanied by a feeling of belief, which may be expressed in the words, "this happened." The mere occurrence of images without this feeling of belief constitutes imagination. It is the element of belief that is the distinctive thing in memory. The role of belief is pertinent to the making of all drawings evidenced in this presentation, in the drawing of them, and also in recalling and re-experiencing them. Memory and imagination intertwine in a space where one believes one is reaching out and touching what is being observed, where belief plays a deciding factor. Miranda relived and believed the experience of being in the room, of making the drawing, of observing herself making the drawing. For Miranda, this happened, even though some things were never initially drawn or were behind her out of view. Throughout this development, Joshua Armitage was involved in observing these outcomes, collating the ideas and applying them to his own teaching and developmental processes, taking outcomes enabled by digital interfaces and returning them to feed back into analog methods, using them and applying them in new ways.
So what I seem to have come across is a way to kind of recreate the kind of alien way of working in virtual reality in a kind of analog way, to try and access the kind of memory in a similar way. At Kingston, we take observational drawing quite seriously because we think that it gives the students greater confidence in themselves and in their work. And once they have that confidence, then they're free to move away from the constraints of observation. To see more clearly, it's beneficial to be able to trust the senses fully and to work with the senses as non-judgmentally as possible. For the students to reach their desired outcomes, they have to navigate a minefield of paradoxes and contradictions, like the brain's reliance on the symbolic visual memory and their own idea of what drawing should look like. So when someone is maybe trying to improve their drawing, the logical, symbolic part of the mind hinders the student's ability to draw what they see. Essentially, they're often overthinking what they're looking at, and trusting what their mind is saying instead of what their eyes are saying. So in the drawing classes, we're often trying to put them in a position where they can circumnavigate around these effects and to place them in a place where they can observe more clearly. That's why VR was interesting, because it cuts off the senses in a way. We thought it might be useful for learning drawing in the same sense. So we also use other techniques in the drawing classes, like very fast drawing, timed drawing, and we also try and break them down to work from a very simple way, just from mark making, and build it back up to something that's more complex. This is why we find VR particularly interesting. It has this curious effect where it both disconnects you from, but also makes you hyper-aware of your usual senses. So after the initial disorientation, your senses adjust very quickly to the new sort of environment they're in. So it kind of shows you how agile the senses are, but also how often and to what extent we take them for granted. So I was present when Miranda made the first life drawing in virtual reality that we witnessed. Martin explained earlier. And what was interesting was that from observing the actual act of drawing, it seemed that the memory was being accessed in a more spatial way, not just as though it was a picture in Miranda's mind, but she was remembering where she was standing and where she was drawing and what was around her at the time. Earlier this year, I was asked to observe a VR workshop at the National Film and Television School. It was a workshop of students from Kingston and from Vienna University of Applied Arts. It was part of a cultural exchange. The students spent the day drawing remembered experiences in VR from a gallery visit the day before. Seeing multiple students working in VR cemented in me the idea that when they're drawing in VR, they're not only accessing memory, but also the other senses at the same time, kind of as we thought we saw with Miranda. This means that they're both working by observing and drawing from memory, but also physically seeing the drawing develop before them and around them. They access their spatial memory as much as their visual memory, it seems. You also get to see the gestural way their arms are moving. And I was trying to find a way that I could kind of apply what we've seen in VR and the VR classes to analog drawing. And I decided to try and integrate ideas of guided meditation into the kind of memory situation in a class where I guide the students in a kind of spatial way through a memory of a life drawing class, as though there is a model there, or as though they're in a life room, but they're not. They're kind of imagining and remembering all at the same time, with the aim of trying to see what exactly they did remember and what exactly they came out with. The method I used tried to replicate the situation VR creates. So first, we cut off the senses, we close our eyes, we sit in silence, and then we start to slowly build details up. So we're building a 3D spatial image in our minds of the room that we're going to draw. I did this by asking them questions so that they could build their own version of the room in their head, the life drawing room with a model in it. So the aim was to move them through a memory in a 3D sense, like VR would, and see what imagery from previous life drawing classes the students would retain. as soon as they started to draw, what seemed to be interesting about this is that, first of all, they weren't just drawing something that was made up. It was definitely connected to memory of the room where we did life drawing and to certain poses, perhaps, that the models were in. The most interesting thing was, though, that it allowed for the freedom of some kind of imagination to come in. So it wasn't purely observing, it was also imagining at the same time. And this seemed to take a little pressure off just the act of observing or remembering. So Angus Mitchell was in this class, and I've got a quote by him here which explains his experience. So, quote, "In the memory class, the decision of how to position the body was taken out of the mind of the model and into mine. In that sense, the students were now the models too." Jarvis Woodman was also in the class, and I have a quote from him as well. "Josh wanted us to imagine and remember being in that space. I remember closing my eyes, and as Josh was describing details of the room, from the way angles of the walls changed to our own individual position in the model, I instantly knew where I was placed. The door was to my right, and I was looking directly at the model. The back of the room felt as if it was closing in behind me. As we continued to explore the room, my position within my head instantly changed." I think what Jarvis explains here links to the experience Miranda had in VR, in that the viewpoint is not singular but more spatial and surrounding. I'll go on to one last quote by Freya Croissant. Quote, "Throughout this class, I was focusing on the memories I had of the space we usually worked in and the light and colours within. Some of the drawings I made were memories of specific life drawing classes, and others were more influenced by artists I was researching and writing about at the time." So I think this is showing that multiple things are occurring in this situation in a similar way to what happens in virtual reality. And it allows for influences from elsewhere to take place during the making of the image. The physical act of drawing is still preserved in the conscious control of the student in both VR and guided memory class. But a 360-degree viewpoint seems to be integrated, as memory seems to be not accessed in a two-dimensional kind of picture-like way, but in more of a spatial way. The students are also allowed the freedom to think about how the image is put together, as they can decide on the variables of where to place their viewpoint within their own memory, as pointed out by Jarvis, which is where imagination, design and reference to other artists can also come into play. The painter Patrick Heron said, quote, "It is not true that the real source of inspiration lies within, nor does it lie without, of course. The real source of inspiration lies at that point at which the inner and the outer intersect, meet and wrestle in an endeavour each to be interpreted into terms of the other. The achieved correspondence of objective and subjective is the goal." This class seems to have taken the students to a place that is reached in virtual reality as well, the same place that Heron is talking about. And this is where I find our observations here really interesting and exciting, as both VR and the analog guided memory class create this disconnect with the senses, but also heighten them at the same time. It allows the students to reach a point where the internal sensations and the external senses meet, and is a really interesting place for them to be when trying to create images. Thank you.